everyone, my name is Alessia Cavazos and I am the Undergraduate Success Librarian at the UTA Libraries. In this virtual workshop, we will review the 3 types of narrative conflict and some examples that can help us understand them. The first one we will go into is man versus man, which can also be described as man versus society. This conflict occurs when characters are pit against each other, or when a character is up against societal determinations of normality or otherness. Think of almost any story and there will be a good and a bad character. The hero is against the evil villain, trying to stop the villain from whatever horribleness they have planned. This is a perfect example of man versus man conflict. However, this can also be described in much simpler terms. Sibling rivalries, familial feuds, quarreling best friends, and competing rivals are all examples of man versus man conflict in narratives. Sometimes there is a fourth narrative structure called man versus society. This can be described as the character facing societal structures that they might be trying to navigate, dismantle, escape, or survive. Examples of this can be dictatorships in dystopian novels, societal expectations of gender, sexuality, or body conformity, expectations of familial structures, racism, etc. However, all of these things are in fact dictated by human beings. Therefore, man versus society would be a product of man versus man conflict. Let's take this example from Looney Tunes. Now, for this example, have a bit of imagination, since animals and humans essentially occupy the same structural role of person in this universe. A big running conflict between Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck is the hunting season. So, while there is man versus man conflict of Bugs and Daffy fighting each other to save themselves from the hunting season itself is dictated by other men, like Elmer Fudd, who perpetuate the hunting season against the other animals in the cartoon. So, in this example, we are able to explore both understandings of the conflict from this one example. The next one is man versus nature, which can be described as man being in conflict with nature. For the most part, this will be a character up against the elements: snow, rain, storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, volcanoes, etc. This can also be a character fighting against their own instincts. Contrarily, entities of nature can be in conflict with the intentions of humans. Think of the Disney movie Moana, where the ocean is really encouraging Moana to help nature, though her family does not want her to. Some fun examples are the ever-famous Bear Grylls, a man who goes out into nature and shows how you can survive. Another more fantastical example is Sharknado, where a tornado whips up the sea and causes sharks to be in the tornadoes, which are then flung onto land and destroy stuff, or eat people. The last one is man versus self. This conflict can be defined by an internal struggle. Some examples could be a character struggling with delusions, lying and therefore causing trouble for themselves, self-sabotaging, or being unable to choose a side, etc. Take this example from Disney's Aladdin. In this movie, Aladdin wishes for a genie to turn him into a prince so that he can get close to Princess Jasmine and court her. To Aladdin's disappointment, Jasmine is unimpressed by his princely facade. Genie suggests that he tell Jasmine the truth, and Aladdin convinces himself that Jasmine would never like him if he weren't a prince. On multiple occasions, when given the chance, he doesn't reveal his true identity to Jasmine. This becomes a point of conflict within Aladdin, and further complicates the other problems within the movie. This is a good example of man versus self, since one main conflict in Aladdin is his insecurity, which leads him to continue lying to Jasmine. So, there are a few other kinds of conflict that I saw when researching that will turn up in many books, movies, and shows. These are man versus machine, man versus the supernatural, man versus fate, so think Oedipus, man versus God or religion. Ex Machina is a movie about androids that turn against their toxic human creators and is a great example of man versus machine. Oedipus Rex, the Greek classic, is a great example of man versus fate, where Oedipus is desperately attempting to avoid killing his father and ending up with his mother, but he falls into his inevitable fate anyway. All of Stephen King's novels are great examples of man versus the supernatural, and Bruce Almighty is a fun example of man versus God. So, once you've defined the narrative conflict in your work, here are some good questions to help you better dissect how this conflict is working within the story. These questions can also help you determine important plot points that you might want to analyze for quotes and textual evidence. What is the conflict being described in the story? How does the story set up the definition for the conflict? This one is very important. You should always pay attention to how conflict is defined. For example, if the conflict is man versus society and the character is facing a dystopian government and class conflict, how does the story define the class that the character is in? How does this definition of society affect the character? How are they oppressed by it? Do they feel trapped? Can they not be their true selves? The next question is, how does this conflict affect the characters, which we just touched on a bit? Then you might ask yourself, how do the characters deal with this conflict? How do they fight it? How do they let it consume them? How do they act differently towards different groups of people because of it? Are they suffering? Are they surviving? Which then leads into our next question. How do characters interact with each other in relation to the conflict? If relationships are being affected by the conflict or are made because of the conflict, this might be a good point to use for analysis. And finally, consider if the conflict is resolved in any way. If it is, how does this change the dynamic between the characters? Once you have deeply dissected your conflict, you can start looking for the various points of analysis in the novel that support or explain the action of the conflict. Some potential points of analysis are recurring themes, imagery or symbolism, characterization and personification, different perspectives that might be used in the story. So, is the story told from the first person or the third person? How would it be different if it were something else? Names and chapter titles always have meaning and can reveal a lot about characters and the conflict of the story. Additionally, if a different language is utilized in the story, pay attention to how and why. Character archetypes, hero, mentor, trickster, or lover, also can play an important role in the story, especially if the characters are troubling these archetypes. Plot structure, such as foreshadowing and irony, can be interesting to analyze, and of course, the diction and the language that the characters use is always important. Now that you've analyzed the conflict, the characters, and any other important points of the novel, it's time to organize your essay. There are a million ways to present your information, but I've provided a quick breakdown for you on how to work through your essay. Of course, your essay should be opening with a thesis, where you introduce your argument and the way that it appears and occurs in the text. Then, use the body of the essay to introduce textual evidence along with your own commentary. This is also a good time to introduce supporting claims from articles that you have researched. You can also use this time to introduce counterpoints to your article. There will always be another side to any idea, but exploring that other side can help you better support your own claim if you can combat it with evidence. Finally, introduce any final points and conclude your essay. So, let's look at what kind of articles work for a literary analysis paper. You will want to find articles that focus on the text and that analyze some of the things we have talked about in this presentation, but always with a focus on the text itself. For example, this article on the Hunger Games looks at the themes of dystopia within the book. It focuses on a man versus society conflict, defines the terms of dystopia and utopia in terms of the novel, explores how these settings affect and influence the characters, and looks across the novels by Suzanne Collins to see how this theme evolves. Most importantly, all of this is framed within the terms of the book. In this article on Alice in Wonderland, the author explores the man versus man conflict of expectations for children and adults, making this also a man versus society conflict. The article defines what it means to be a child and an adult in terms of the book, and how these societal definitions affect the characters, how the characters challenge these definitions. This article also touches on themes of infantilization and power within the story. This article looks at the Grimm brothers' Briar Rose, the inspiration for the tale of Sleeping Beauty. The author focuses on conflicts of man versus man and man versus society through the expectation of gender that the story sets. The performance of gender is then punished or rewarded based on the character's actions. This can also be understood as an exploration of archetypes. This article does a good job of focusing on these definitions in terms of the story and not applying our cultural terms to the analysis. While that kind of work is perfectly acceptable for certain kinds of research and studies, for a strictly literary analysis, it's best for us to stick to the definitions that are in the text and concluded to by the audience through examples of quotes, narrative, or setting. This final article on Harry Potter does many of the same things as the other articles. It focuses on some narrative conflict within the story, explores how definitions of this conflict, in this case materialism, affects the characters and their morality and choices, and explores themes of good, evil, and authenticity. The last thing we will go over is how to sandwich quotes. This can also be understood as how to introduce or frame your quotes. In the next slide, I have created an example of how to sandwich a quote with your own commentary, as well as a background for the quote. Before we step into that, let's take a quick look at this little visual aid I've created. Within the sandwich, you can see the layers of how to present a quote within your paper. Firstly, start off with background for how the quote is being presented is best. Then, remember to mention who is saying the quote. Once you've introduced the quote, you can move on to why it is being said and how it relates to your paper's purpose. So, let's look at an example of how this could be set up. Okay, so let's read over this example that I've created for something someone might write for an Alice in Wonderland paper on the role of knowing for children and adults in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. When Alice finds herself once again grown large from drinking of the Drink Me bottles in the White Rabbit's house, she laments that her life has become quite wild and confusing since she decided to chase the rabbit down the rabbit hole. In this reflective monologue, Alice says to herself, "When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied that kind of thing never happened. There ought to be a book written about me, and when I grow up, I'll write one. But I'm a grown-up now." This keys to the recurring conflict of adulthood and childhood, and what it means for one to be little or grown. Quite literally for Alice, she finds herself both shrinking and growing quite often throughout the story. She seems to confuse being older with being bigger, and therefore knowing wiser, being able to do more things, just as she thinks she would be able to write a book about herself when she is grown. Though, while she is bigger, she is not older, and Alice laments this fact, saying, "Shall I never get any older than I am now? That'll be a comfort, one way, never to be an old woman, but then always lessons to learn." This certainly suggests that Alice believes someone who is grown should know best, and she, being little, though very tall, feels she is being forced to continue learning. Here, we continue to see the conflict of knowing and ignorance, and childhood and adulthood explored. Now, let's break it down. The first few sentences introduce the background for the quote. In this example, I am explaining what has led Alice to the point where she is frustrated with growing and shrinking and what has brought her to say what I've quoted. Then, I frame the quote by introducing who says it. So, I say, Alice says to herself to let readers know it's a monologue. Then I put a comma, then open the quotation, then close the quotation, and finally end with parenthetical citation. The next few sentences cues readers to how this quote relates to the point of my thesis or paper, and then the next portion further explains this through my own commentary on the quote. Finally, I felt like quoting a line or two that came right after my original quote, so in order to tie that in, I did the exact same thing. I introduced the background, framed it by telling the audience who was speaking, and then explained how it related to my point through my own commentary. So, we have gone over a lot in this presentation. I hope that you found it helpful. Let's take a quick review of what we've learned. In this presentation, we went over the different types of narrative conflict, questions to reflect on, and potential points of analysis when deciding on your topic, how to organize your essay, and what kinds of articles work for literary analysis paper, and how to frame your quotes. If you have questions, feel free to reach out, and thank you so much for working through this workshop with me on narrative analysis and narrative conflict.